Hi, everybody, and welcome to Fast Finish Quilts. If you have any questions today for our presenter, please type them into the questions box, and we're going to have a short question and answer session at the very end. We do have 4 wonderful handouts today. There's a couple patterns in there, so make sure you locate those on the handouts tab throughout the webinar. If you missed downloading the handouts, don't worry. The handouts will be available on BERNINA.com in a few days. And in the follow-up email from GoToWebinar, there will be a link that you can also download the handouts. If you're viewing on an Apple product today, your screen might look a little different. You might have to swipe either left or right on your screen to either view the presentation or the PowerPoint. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, the best thing to do is exit the webinar, close your internet browser, and relaunch. That should take care of most audio or visual difficulties. Now I'd like to welcome Christy Burcham today. She is our presenter. Hi, Christy.
Hi, Emily. Thanks for the introduction. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fast Finish Quilts. I'm so excited to have you here today. And as Emily said, we do have some handouts for you, and they are available for you in the download tab of the webinar platform. So you can see a little section that says handouts, and there are 4 handouts there, 3 patterns, and a note sheet that goes over all the things that I'm going to be talking about today. So as you're watching, you might be thinking, oh, I'd like to take some notes, and you are scribbling things down really fast. Don't worry, there's a note sheet for you in the handouts that covers all the main things that you're probably going to want to remember. So in addition to these handouts being posted in the handouts section of GoToWebinar, I've also placed them on a Dropbox link. So if that's easier for you to grab the files that way, you're welcome to do so. And to get that Dropbox link, you're going to go to tiny.cc. So you can put your HTTP in first, or you just type tiny.cc /fastfinishquilts. So if you type that web address into your web browser, that's going to take you directly to the Dropbox link that's going to have all 4 of those handouts there for you. So you can grab them that way. So let's get started in terms of Fast Finish Quilts. I was inspired to do this presentation as many of you have probably been in that situation where I needed to finish a gift very quickly, and we've all probably been in that situation, you know, where we've got a baby shower or a wedding shower or something coming up, and we need to finish something in a hurry. You know, there are quilts that we spend years or maybe even decades finishing and taking our time and really putting all that love and attention into them. And that's great. We love those kinds of quilts. I've got several of those in my collection, but then there are also those quilts that you need to get done, and you want to get something done quickly. So I'm going to start out by giving you some examples of some patterns that I have found that are quick to stitch up, and kind of what you look for in a pattern when you're trying to find one that's going to finish up quickly. So let's take a look. Probably my favorite go-to pattern when I have something that I need to do in a hurry, but I still want something that's a substantial size and that feels like a quilt, that's not, you know, that really uses some different fabrics and is fun and interesting to look at, is the Yellow Brick Road pattern. I love this pattern. It's from Atkinson Designs. Most of your local dealers, your local BERNINA dealer is probably going to carry this pattern or could very easily order it for you. And many of them have probably made it. It's been around for quite a while. It's a fantastic pattern. So again, it's called Yellow Brick Road. It's by Atkinson Designs. And when you take a look at this pattern, you're going to see something that you're going to see commonly in some of the other patterns I'm going to recommend, and that is it's a lot of straight lines. So when you have to finish something in a hurry, that's one thing you want to look for, is your blocks, your rectangles. Those straight lines are going to be faster to sew than when you start doing half squares or quarter square triangles. I am going to talk a little bit about triangles later, but absolutely, if you're trying to finish something in a hurry, straight lines is always going to be faster. It's quicker to cut too. So this is one of my favorite patterns. Then also, this pattern is called Alfresco, and this is one of the free handouts in your handouts tab. It is from Benertex Studios, and if you go to benertex.com, so that's BENARTEX.com, They have a library of free patterns, literally hundreds of free patterns to choose from. But I picked out a couple of them for you that are quick to finish, and this one again is called Al Fresco. It's a great one that you can use a lot of different fabrics. It makes a great scrappy quilt. But you can notice here that you've got a background, which is the dark blue, and then the rest is pretty scrappy. So if you've got a fabric line you've purchased, or you've got some pre-cuts that you've purchased and you want to use up, this is a great way to use it. And then you just add in this focus fabric, and that kind of ties everything together. So this pattern is called Al Fresco. Another great pattern that is a simple to sew pattern and is a really fun one for showing off a favorite fabric is this one called Framed Daisies. This is also in your free handouts, in your handout section, or on that link I shared earlier. And it also can be found on vendortext.com under the free patterns area. This one is designed, as you can see, to show off this specific pattern fabric line called Oops a Daisy from Canvas. But you can see it has a nice big focus block and then smaller blocks within each block. And that focus block is a great one if you've got a novelty fabric, which a lot of times we're doing for gift quilts. We're using a novelty fabric because we're making something that is a theme that somebody we know would like to have. So this is a great one to show off those novelty fabrics. And again, very quick to stitch up. This one, not only does it have a lot of straight lines, but you can see the blocks are all the same type of block. They're oriented differently, but they're all the same type of block, which is going to make your chain piecing easier. So we'll talk a little bit more about chain piecing later. But when you're choosing a pattern, if you choose one where all the blocks are the same, it's going to go much faster than if you're doing something with a lot of different types of blocks in it. Another thing that you'll notice in this particular pattern, and again, this can really speed things up for you, especially if you're a beginner, is that this quilt is sashed. So what's nice about having a quilt that's sashed, if you're a beginner, is that if each of these individual squares don't turn out exactly perfect, your sashing is a great way to kind of adjust for that. So you can make your sashing just a little bit wider to accommodate for a block that's a little bit smaller. So it's a great way if you've got a beginner to add some sashing in. The other thing about sashing is it makes the quilt bigger faster because you've got that border in that allows the quilt to be a little bit bigger. So that pattern again is called Framed Daisies, and it's in your free downloads. The next pattern I want to talk to you about is the Seabirds quilt. You can find this on our blog, wealsew.com. You could search for Seabirds, or also in the handout section that I've given you, I've got a cheat sheet with the notes and all of the links to the patterns that are online patterns I'm sharing with you here are on the handout that I have posted there. So you can download that link sheet, and it's going to have everything that you need to know. So this is the Seabirds quilt. This is just a little corner of the finished quilt, but let me show you the layout of the total quilt and why this qualifies as a fast finish. First, it's pretty small, so it's a great size for a baby quilt. But you can see it does have some half squares, but it uses them in a row format. So if you want to do something where it's got a little bit more interest, it's not just all straight lines, but you've got some triangles in there, using these half squares in a row is a really quick way to use them, because then you're only having to match them up to each other and not triangle to triangle. That triangle to triangle is where you have to kind of slow down a little bit to make sure that your points match. So by using it in a row format, it kind of saves some of that time in terms of having to match things up. Row quilts are also a great way to get something done quickly, and you can do row quilts that are just strips of fabric and are quick and easy, or you can intersperse them with something like these half square triangles. So I love this quilt, really super simple to make, and you can do your half squares whatever method you prefer to do them. So again, this is the Seabirds quilt, which you can find on wealsew.com, or also check out that link sheet. This next pattern is called Simple Strips, and it's by Krista Watson, and this again is on wealsew.com and on your link sheet if you want the link directly to this pattern. It is a free pattern on wealsew.com, and you can see again straight lines, very easy to put together, and it's got that same thing that that alfresco pattern had, where it's scrappy with the background. And so the background ties everything together, and then you've got your scrappy fabrics. So again, really quick and easy to put together. And with there being the long strips, it goes together pretty quickly. So that's Simple Strips by Krista Watson. The next one that I'm going to show you is called the Stay Gold quilt. This is a great beginner's quilt, and it is a sew-along on weallsew.com. And so as a sew-along, it's a several-part series that's going to walk you through creating the quilt from the very beginning, including selecting the fabrics and planning out your quilt, all the way through actually quilting and binding the quilt. So all the steps of the quilting process are included in that quilt along. So if you feel like you need that little bit of extra hand holding with your quilt process, this is a really great quilt to do. Again, it's on weallsew.com, and it's called Stay Gold. This is another great pattern. If you're trying to find something that sews up in a hurry, you might be thinking I could just do squares, but an alternative to doing just a scrappy square quilt is to do something like this buffalo plaid. And this is a quilt that I found on a blog called Center Street Quilts. And I did place the link for this pattern on your link sheet. So if you download that link sheet, you're going to find a pattern for this buffalo plaid. I just love this. I think it's really trendy, and it would be a great gift for anyone. So, and you could do it in different colors, but just using that gray, black, and white really gives you something that has a lot of pop. Very quick to put together. And then the next pattern that I have for you also is a free download in your handout section. So you can download that directly in your handouts, and it's also on that link sheet, and it is in the Dropbox download that I give you. And this is a serger quilt designed by Amanda Murphy. So we'll talk a little bit more about using your serger for piecing, but this one is designed specifically to be done on the serger. Now, if you don't have a serger, you don't want to do it on the serger, you certainly could do it on your sewing machine. But you can see that the way this quilt is designed, it's got some large sections and then some borders in between. It really does lend itself well to something like doing it on a serger. And it is strip pieced, and strip piecing is, of course, a great way to finish things quickly. So this is the BERNINA serger quilt by Amanda Murphy. So we've talked about some quilt patterns that allow you to finish in a hurry when you've got something quick. Now let's talk about some different ways that you can adapt patterns to make them go faster. And one is to do a quilt as you go. And if you haven't done quilt as you go before, we have a tutorial on weallsew.com, and it's just for a table runner, but it will teach you the concept of how you create a quilt as you go quilt. And so when you're doing quilting as you go, you're actually sandwiching your batting and your fabric together and sewing all of that together, and then you do a flip and you flip those fabrics out. So that's what makes it finish so fast, is that not only have you pieced it, but you've also quilted it all in one step. So it's a really fun technique, and this table runner is a really great way to learn it. And once you learn that quilt as you go technique, you can apply it to other quilt as you go patterns. So I would really encourage you to try this one out. It's really fun and simple and quick to sew. Now, another technique when it comes to being able to finish your quilts in a hurry is to create something with bigger blocks. So when you're looking for a pattern, one is to look for straight lines, two is to look for rows, and the next thing is to choose something with oversized blocks. So we'll start with going to the extreme, and this is the Union Square quilt, which you can find on weallsew.com. It's on your link sheet as well, a free pattern on weallsew.com for the Union Square, and you can see it's basically one big block. So when you're doing a big block, there's not as many pieces to deal with. It takes a little bit longer to cut out because you're cutting out bigger pieces of fabric, but it sews up very quickly, and it really has an amazing impact. So if you've been wanting to try something that's more of a modern quilt, finding a quilt that's basically one big block is a great way to start, and it's a great way to finish something quickly. So again, this is called the Union Square quilt. Now, another trick is to double your block size. So if you've got a pattern you really like, but you want to finish it faster or you want to make it bigger, you can double the block size of what's originally called for. So here's a couple of examples. This is the Arlo quilt by Carolyn Friedlander that was stitched up by Heather Grant, our manager of BERNINA education programs. And what she did is she took the pattern and enlarged it. So she doubled it in size, which allowed her to finish it faster and also to get a bigger finish out of it. And then here's another example. This is the January quilt by Liz Havertine. And again, you're going to double the size and you get a quicker finish. So if you're using a quilt that has templates, you can do this by enlarging the template on a copier and just increasing it by 200%. But one thing you do have to keep in mind is your size of your seam allowance. So you're not doubling the size of your seam allowance, just the block itself. So if you're doing a pattern that is a rotary cut pattern that doesn't use templates, it does take a little bit of math to figure out how to do that doubling in size. But that little bit of math ahead of time to figure out what size you need to cut your blocks will save you a lot of time when you actually go to sew it together because you're working with bigger blocks. Working with bigger blocks is also a great way for a beginner. If you've got a pattern you love, but you feel like it might be a little challenging, try doubling it. And by doubling it, you have a little bit more space to work with, and it usually makes it a little bit less challenging to assemble. So that's our second technique, is to double the size of the block. Another way to finish your quilts quickly or to be able to get a quilt off in a dash is to learn a few basic blocks that you can use over and over again in your quilts. And one of my favorites that's really simple to assemble is the disappearing four patch. So let me show you how to do the disappearing four patch. Here's an example of a quilt made with the disappearing four patch. It's a really simple quilt, and it's something that you can repeat at different sizes. You can do a lot of variations on it. Here you can see I used just several different solid colors, but it's a great one for your prints as well. And you can use a background fabric to help tie everything together, or you can make it totally scrappy. So let me show you how you make a disappearing four patch. It's a very simple block, and once you learn it, you'll have it memorized and you can use it anytime. So with this, I started with 4-inch squares, and so those 4-inch squares are going to include the seam allowance. So I'm cutting them at 4 inches, but you could really do this at any size. The proportions are going to be the same in terms of starting with squares, but when you actually go to assemble it, you could start with 8-inch squares, you can do 12-inch squares, whatever size you want those finished squares to be. But here I started with a 4-inch square, so each of these 4 squares is 4 inches. And you need 2 different fabrics to create a disappearing four patch. So I've alternated my fabrics, my yellow, my pink, my yellow, and you're just going to sew them together like a four patch. You sew your 2 opposite pieces together, and then you sew those 2 rows together to create your four patch. Once you've got the four patch, now we've got to make that four patch disappear. So I started with 4-inch squares. What I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to cut on either side of my seam lines. So you can see here we've laid out a ruler and placed the ruler 1 inch from the center. The distance from the center is going to vary depending on the size of the block you have and the look you want to create. So whether you want those center pieces to be very skinny or wider, you can play around with this to decide. It's not have to be the same every single time to decide how you want to cut it. But if you want one that looks just like mine, started with 4-inch squares, and I cut a 1 inch from the center line. So I cut 1 inch from all 4 on all 4 sides of the center line. So 1 cut here, and then here you can see how I've cut it. So you've got your piece, and it's still a four patch, but as soon as you spread it out, you can see it starts to look a little different once you spread that four patch apart. You've cut on either side of the seams 1 inch, and now you simply take the 4 pieces that are the center pieces here, and you're going to rotate them. So you can see here I've rotated those 4 pieces, and then you sew those back together in rows, and you get your disappearing four patch. So it's a really simple block to create, and a lot of fun, and it's got that shortcut of starting with the four patch and then creating the disappearing four patch. So it's a really fun block to create. And like I said, you can do it any size, and it sews together really nicely. It's a lot of straight lines. It's a really simple block to learn. The next block I want to talk to you about is the rail fence. And most of you are probably familiar with the rail fence. Rail fence is usually 3 strips of equal size cut into squares. You can do it in a strip piecing technique. And you can then sew all those blocks together by rotating them. I'm going to show you a rail fence where the pieces are of uneven sizes. And so here you can see I've actually cut my pieces. I did one that was 3.5 inches, 2.5 inches, and 1.5 inches. And then I seamed them together. And with this one, I did use a serger to sew these strips together. A rail fence is a great opportunity to use your serger. Of course, you can use your sewing machine, but with the serger, it's so fast. It sews together so fast. And I'm able to do, these are just straight line strips, and so you can just feed them right through the serger really quick. And you can see it also gives you a really neat finish on the inside. So if you've got a quilt that you're going to make a top that you know you aren't going to quilt for a while, it's kind of nice to have that finished edge on your seams. So this is strip pieced, and I did, as again, a 3.5, a 2.5, a 1.5 inch strip, sewed them together, and then I squared the strips to 6 inches wide before I cut them into squares. So squared the strips to 6 inches wide and then cut them into 6-inch squares. And you can see here, I actually did 2 different variations, still 3.5, 2.5, 1.5, but in one quilt, I put the 1.5 in the middle in one row, and in the other row, I put the 1.5 inch strip on the end. Now with a rail fence, you can do this either way. You could make them all the same, or you can get some variation by playing around with the order that you put the strips in. Or if you want something really scrappy, it doesn't have to be the same strips all the way through the whole quilt. But that strip piecing, making the long strips and then cutting them apart is, again, one of those ways to really make your quilt go fast. So here I've cut my 6-inch squares, and then I've just arranged them. You can get sort of a pinwheel look by arranging the blocks different ways. And you have a lot of flexibility with a rail fence. And one thing I like to do with a rail fence is if you have a design wall, this is a great opportunity to use it, because you're really going to want to play around with which way do you orient the blocks, and especially if you're doing something scrappy, where you want to place everything. But a rail fence is a really fast way to finish a quilt. Now, I said earlier we were going to talk about half squares and how to use them if you do want to use them in a quilt. And one thing I want to encourage you is to try doing half squares kind of the old-fashioned way. So many of us have learned a lot of half square triangle techniques, and there are some wonderful techniques out there, and I don't want to disparage any of them. There are some great techniques where you start with the square, you draw a line, a diagonal line on the square, maybe you sew on either side of that line and then you cut it in half. There are triangle papers. There are lots of different ways that you can get a half square triangle, and you should use whatever method you like the best. But I do want to share with you that by using and learning how to cut your fabric actually into half squares and sewing the half squares together is actually faster than some of those other methods. So one way that you can do this is by using a half square ruler. And so here I have a half square ruler. This is from Nifty Notions, the half square ruler. And what you do with the half square ruler is you actually start with a strip of fabric. So here I started with a 3-inch strip of fabric, and then you place the ruler. There's a marking on the ruler that's at 3 inches, and then there's also a little marking on the ruler. You can see it has like a little tail, and you align that tail, that 1/4 inch, off the edge of your piece, and then you cut the diagonal. So you can see here's your cut piece. Then you flip the ruler the other direction and you cut the straight. And you just go back and forth, diagonal, straight, diagonal, straight. And by using this strip piece method of cutting your half squares, I actually have layered my 2 different fabrics that I want for my half squares together, my 2 different patterns, and I'm cutting them. And then what you end up with when you cut with this ruler is you can see there's a notch. by using this special ruler, there's a notch that is cut out of one end. And this makes it easier to place the two pieces together and sew them together because you're lining up that notch and then you're stitching. Now you may be thinking, oh no, I'm going to be stitching on the bias edge at this point, and you are going to be stitching on the bias side of your triangles. But once you learn how to stitch on the bias side, you'll find that it really goes so much faster than having to do those extra steps of cutting your triangles apart later and squaring them up. If you use the dual feed on your Bernina, you're going to find that that bias edge is not going to curl on you, and you're really going to find, it's not going to stretch out, you're really going to find a good quality half square triangle. And so here I've got my two half square triangles, and then I've sewn them together to create my pinwheel block. So that is, again, just using a half square ruler makes it a really fast way to put together if you want to do quilts with half squares. So we talked about a specialty ruler. I do want to talk about some other notions that you might want to be interested in using. And one of them is called the strip tube ruler. So this is also another kind of different way to create triangles. And this is the strip tube ruler from Cozy Quilt Designs. And you can see a picture of it here. And it is actually done by taking two strips and you sew on both sides of the strip and then you cut them apart with this special ruler. And there are a lot of patterns out there that are made specifically to use with this strip tube ruler. This is just one of them called Radio Waves. So a great tool if you're wanting to finish something quickly. I've made several quilts with this strip tube ruler, and it does make for a fast finish. Another thing that's so important when you're trying to finish a quilt quickly is please use a good quality rotary cutter that feels great in your hand, that you're not going to get tired of cutting. I really like the Tulip Pink rotary cutter because of the way it feels in my hand. But even more importantly than the rotary cutter is the blade. Making sure your blade is fresh makes such a difference. And we all know this, but we sometimes let ourselves go too long without changing that blade, and it really slows down the process. You have to cut. If you miss a part, you have to cut again, or you have to cut more slowly because your blade is dull. So switch out that blade more often, and you're going to find that your quilts are going to finish up faster. Now, when you dispose of that old blade, there is a notion out there, I love it, it's called the blade saver, and you take an old blade, this picture here shows it without the blade in it, but you actually put the blade inside this flower shape, and this is for cutting apart your chain pieced pieces. And so you can actually just take your chain piece pieces and kind of push down, and it's just going to cut that thread. It's really fast and it's weighted, so it sits nicely on your table, and you can just quickly cut apart your chain pieced pieces. Also, of course, if you're piecing at the sewing machine, there's nothing that's going to make it easier than a 1/4 inch foot. And Bernina has a lot of patchwork feet to choose from, so it's just about choosing which one you like the best. So you can see here, we do have a blog post on weallsew.com about the different patchwork feet and how you choose the one that's best for you. There are 3 different patchwork feet in 2 different styles. So there's a 37 patchwork foot. It's 1/4 inch on either side, and there are 1/4 inch markings to the front and the back of the needle, which is really going to make it for when you need to pivot, things like that, or when you're doing a block that you need to stop a 1/4 inch away from the edge. That 1/4 inch mark to the beginning and behind the needle is really helpful. So 37 is a 1/4 inch on both sides of the needle. Then there's a 57 foot, and the 57 is just like the 37, except it has a guide. So if you like to have that little bit of an extra guide of something to butt your fabric up against, that's the 57. And then finally there's the 97, and the 97 foot is a 1/4 inch from the right, or from the needle to the right of the foot. And then from the needle to the left, there is a 1/4 inch mark from the needle to the left, or to the inside toe of the left side, but then the foot itself actually extends a little further. And the 97 foot is designed for use with 9mm machines, because 9mm machines, those that do a 9mm wide stitch, have a wider feed dog. So by using the 97 foot, it has that wider side on the left-hand side that gives you more contact between the foot and the feed dog, that wider feed dog. And so some people find that they really prefer that foot because it gives them more coverage and a little bit more control of piecing. So there's 37, 57, 97, and each of those come in both a regular version and a dual feed version. So if you have a machine with dual feed, you can choose the 37, 57, or 97 dual feed. I definitely like to use dual feed with my piecing, and so I would recommend, if you have dual feed as an option, to definitely go with the dual feed foot. Now, another tool that's really helpful, another notion that's really helpful, is a good sharp needle. This is really going to make your quilts go faster if you're not having to take things out, and you will find your seams are much more precise if you use a good quality needle. Now, everybody has their own personal preference of what they like to piece with, but I'll share you my recommendation, and that is I like to piece with a jeans needle. I use a jeans size 80 needle when I'm piecing, and that jeans needle has a nice super sharp point and it really penetrates quickly, especially and even with fabrics like batiks where they've got a little bit of a finish on them, that jeans needle really penetrates them nicely. So that's what I like to use for piecing. And then, of course, you're going to have to do some ripping now and then, and having a good quality seam ripper really makes a difference. So if you've got a BERNINA, it comes with an excellent seam ripper, but if you don't, then be sure you invest in a good quality seam ripper. It'll save you a ton of time. Let's talk about a few time-saving techniques. We've talked about patterns and notions. Now let's talk about some techniques. And the first one is chain piecing. Now, most of us have learned to do chain piecing at some point or another, and I personally like to use the BERNINA hover feature with my chain piecing. So what is the hover feature? The hover feature is on the 5 series, the 5 set 590 and up have the hover feature, and what this allows you to do is when you stop sewing and you have the needle down, set at needle down, the foot will automatically raise when you stop sewing. And I love this for chain piecing because I can piece right through, and then you can see when you get to the end, the needle is down, but the foot comes up and it's up and ready for me to put my next piece of fabric right in there. If you get in a good rhythm with this, the hover feature is such a time saver in terms of going from piece to piece to piece without having to lift or lower your presser foot. It does it for you. Now, some people prefer to use the BERNINA freehand system to get that same effect because you can sew, have your needle stop down in the fabric, and then rather than waiting for the hover feature to lift, you can push with your knee to lift your foot with the freehand system and slide the next piece right in. Some people like this because you can just barely lift the foot and scoot the fabric in, which is nice. I actually had knee surgery, so for me, the hover feature is so much better because I don't have as much flexibility in my knee, and so that is a great way to use the hover instead of the freehand system. Both methods work really good, but the idea is that you're going to go have the needle down, so the needle should be stopping down. And then after you finish a piece, you put the next piece right in place, as you can see here. And the closer you can get, just butt it up right up against the needle when you do that chain piecing. Just go right up against the needle and then keep sewing, and you've got a beautiful chain piecing. Then when you get done with going from piece to piece to piece, you can use that blade saver cutter to cut your pieces apart. Now, another technique that I would like to recommend to you, and this might be a little controversial to you if you haven't tried it before, but that is to use finger pressing throughout the block rather than pressing with the iron until you finish the whole block. This is a technique that I learned from my friend Kay England, who is a great quilt designer. Many of you may know of her, and she is the one that taught me the technique that when you're doing a block, like this pinwheel block, for example, I only finger pressed this block until I got the whole block done, and then I took it to the iron. So this does two things. One, we're talking about time saving here today, so that's the first thing. It's less time that you're having to either get up or turn to your ironing station and press after every single piece, because you're only doing it after each block. And it takes a little getting used to just doing that finger pressing, but I actually find I am more precise when I'm using finger pressing than when I'm pressing everything. The other thing about using this technique of only finger pressing until you get to the end of the block is that it helps keep you from stretching out your blocks when you do your pressing. One of the things we tend to do when we're pressing is we really push, and sometimes we can stretch out those blocks, and then we end up having to square things up because we've stretched them with the pressing technique. So by finger pressing until you finish the block, you're going to have a more precise finish. So give it a try. If you haven't tried it before, it really does save a lot of time. Try on a couple of blocks and just try doing your finger pressing instead of taking it to the iron every time. Now, one thing that's really important if you're gifting a quilt or you're trying to finish something quickly is you still have to bind it. So what are some ways that you can finish your binding quickly? One is to use the binder attachment. And we do have in the link sheet that I provided for you a great tutorial on wealsew.com. It also has a video that's going to show you exactly how to use that binding tool. Once you learn how to use this binding tool, it is a huge time saver. And it really does give you very precise binding, and it's done all in one step. Whereas with many of the binding techniques we do, we're sewing it on and then we're flipping to the back, so we're taking 2 steps. Here we're sewing it on and sewing it to the back all in one step. So that learning to use your binder is a great way to finish your quilts quickly. Another quick way, if you like to use just the single fold binding and then flip to the back side, is to do it with an overlocker. And again, in your link sheet, we have a link to wealsew.com with a tutorial on how to do this, to actually sew the binding on with an overlocker. This can be really quick and fast, sews up really quickly. It's also great because it does seal in all those edges. So if you are going to hand sew the piece to the back, it's nice and tidy that you're wrapping around. The edge you're wrapping around is really nice and tidy. Now, one other trick that you can do with this is you can put fusible thread in your lower looper. And then when you wrap the fabric to the back, you can press it and it's going to hold it in place until you get a chance to stitch it down by hand. It doesn't quite work for a gift, but if it's a quilt that's maybe going on the wall or something that you have to display quickly, you don't even have to do the hand stitching because it's held in place. So I love that technique of using the fusible thread in the lower looper. Now, the other thing you can do to save a lot of time on binding is to wrap the binding around, and then rather than hand stitching that binding in place, to machine stitch it in place. And sometimes people don't really like the look of that because it leaves a little bit of a flange if you're sewing it on with a straight line. But one technique you can try is to use either a decorative stitch or a zigzag stitch when you're wrapping that binding around and sewing it in place. And using that decorative stitch or that zigzag stitch is going to kind of encase the edge of your binding, and it gives you a little bit different look. And I find it also gives me a little bit of grace if I'm not exactly perfectly straight. And so that allows me to finish it faster as well. And as you can see in the image here, we're using a walking foot. When doing that technique, I think it really makes that process go smoother and quicker if you use a walking foot. And on your link sheet, you're also going to find a tutorial on how to do this particular technique on wealsew.com. So once you've got your project bound, you're finished, and you've finished your quilt quickly, hopefully you've learned some techniques that are going to help you finish your next project a little bit faster, gotten some pattern ideas and some things that you might want to try. Again, that link to find the materials that we talked about today is on tiny.cc/fastfinishquilts. Or if you're watching the webinar live, you can download it right from the handouts link. So with that, I'm going to ask Emily if we've got any questions.
Hey, hi, everybody. We do have a few questions here. Marilyn wanted to know which serger did you use to piece your rail fence?
So a couple different sergers I have used. The one that I used for this particular quilt is the one that I have at home right now, which is the BERNINA L890. I love the L890. I can't say enough good things about the L890. It is a serger that has a screen on it, and when I select my stitch, it automatically sets all of the stitches in place and everything's ready to go. So that's the one I used with this particular sample. But another great serger that I have used in the past for piecing quilts together is the BERNINA L460. Is another great serger. Any of the BERNINA sergers are going to be great for this, but that's what I chose. One thing I didn't mention is which stitch to use. There's a couple different options. If you want something that's really super sturdy, you can use a 4-thread overlock stitch. But if you want something that's a little bit faster and doesn't use quite so much thread, you can also use a 3-thread overlock stitch.
Okay. And Annette wanted to know if you can show the back of your pinwheel block. She wanted to see how your blocks were joined together after using the specialty ruler.
Yes.
Christy's gonna do her best to show it to you.
Yes. Okay. Let's see if I can get it up here. Here's the back. And you can see, oh, it's not very good zoom here. Here's the front. You can see I've got a nice point on there, and there is the back.
You can see where the notches are cut out and where she lined up her block.
Oh, the notches. Okay, yes. So because it's already sewn together, it's kind of hard to see, but like here is where the notch is. Now, when you're using that ruler, because it's got the notch, what basically happens is one side you'll still have a dog ear. So if you're doing, if you're used to doing half square triangles, you know that when you press them open, you have these 2 little dog ears, right? And you have to cut the dog ears off before you sew them together. When you use that specialty ruler, because it has the little notch on the side, you only have 1 dog ear because the other dog ear is already cut off with that notch. And so that's another part of what saves you the time is you have only 1 dog ear to cut off. So.
Okay. And we had a question about the binder attachments. Are they available for all BERNINA machines? Specifically, Deanne has the B480 Special Edition.
Yes, the binder will work with the B480, and yes, all of the BERNINA machines are compatible with the binder. You do need 2 pieces, so you're buying the binder itself, and then the foot that goes with it is 95. So you're going to use 95. There's also a 95C for those of you who have a 9mm wide machine. You would use 95C, and the difference is that 95 foot is just a little narrower on the right so that the binder can slide right up next to it. There are different binders that are different sizes, so depending on which size, how wide you like your finished binding to be, there are 3 different sizes of binder, and there's also a binder that is for single fold, or that's for unfolded bias tape, rather, that you put it in as 1 piece that's already unfolded, or you can use a pre-folded bias tape, and there's a different binder for that.
I know I love the binder attachment. I have quite a few of those, and worth every penny for my time. So, yep. And then Laura has a question on, do you have any quick ideas for fast quilting on the top, or how to get a more accurate stitch in the ditch?
Okay, yes, absolutely. So fast quilting on the top, one thing I would recommend if you really want to be fast is not to stitch in the ditch. Stitch on either side of the ditch. And the reason is, if you stitch in the ditch, you have to be really precise. And if you were 100% perfect with your piecing, which I don't know about you guys, but I'm not always 100% perfect. So if you weren't 100% perfect with your piecing, you're having to kind of follow that little bit of wave you might have here and there when you're stitching in the ditch. So you have to go really slow and be really precise. So what I would recommend is go 1/4 inch away from the ditch, and you can either do just one side or both sides of the ditch 1/4 inch away, and that you have a little bit more forgiveness and it goes really fast. So if you need to quilt in a hurry, just a straight stitch, walking foot quilting is a really quick way to finish. You really don't need to quilt as much as you think you do. You don't need to quilt every inch. Check your batting. Many quilts can have 4 to even 8 inches apart that need to be quilted. Personally, I like to quilt at least every 4 inches or so, but you know, even though we have this expectation, we tend to really kind of over quilt our quilts, and not that that's a bad thing if you want it quilted that way, but especially for a gift, it doesn't have to be quilted that much for it to last and really hold up. And then in terms of getting a little bit more precise stitch in the ditch, one thing is to use a thread that blends. You can either use an invisible thread or choose a thinner thread, like a 100-weight thread, that is going to not be so obvious if you do veer off one side or the other. So using a thinner weight thread, and also using the attachment, the walking foot attachment that has the blade in the center that's going to help you keep straight while you're quilting.
Okay. And Pauline had a question. What is your favorite type of thread for piecing?
Oh, that's a great question. So my personal favorite is I like to use the Mettler Silk Finish. Now, most people use the 50 weight for piecing. And if you're doing some of these fast finish quilts, the 50 weight for piecing is fine. But if you're doing things that have really tiny pieces and you've got to have really precision, I actually prefer the 60 weight silk finish. It's a little thinner, and it allows you to have less bulk in the seam because you've got that thinner thread. So personally, I quilt everything, or I piece everything with the Mettler Silk Finish 60 weight, but the 50 weight is also good for piecing.
Okay. And Christine says, I have a 20-year-old quilt that has fabric that is worn out in some places. How can I go about fixing worn pieces that have holes?
Oh, that's a great question. So one thing is there are a lot of great tutorials about quilt repair that you can find out there. So definitely do your research, but you absolutely can repair a quilt by replacing the pieces that are worn. The trick is to just remove only the part that you need to resew. And then what I do is, rather than trying to take out such a big piece and then piece it back in, is to actually take a piece that is the size that you're going to replace and then pre-press the seam allowance into it and top stitch it in place. So rather than trying to recreate the entire seam, because otherwise you end up having to take out quite a lot. But there are a lot of different quilt repair techniques out there that you can pursue. You know, another way that you can always do it, a quick way, is to add an applique. Is never a bad idea when you're replacing or when you're repairing a quilt. Sometimes you can actually get sort of a design opportunity. But if it's a vintage quilt and you're really trying to restore the original look, you can pre-press those seam allowances in place and then sort of top stitch your replacement piece in place.
Okay, that's a great question. And we do have a few people asking about compatibility for the binder attachment. Is there a place on the BERNINA website that they can visit to check on that for their machine?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. The quickest and easiest way to know, and it's actually for any accessory in the BERNINA line, is if you will Google, and this is the quickest way to find it, just Google BERNINA accessory catalog, and then you're going to find the BERNINA accessory catalog on BERNINA.com. And there is a catalog that lists every foot that's available and every machine that it's compatible with. And so there's a little chart. You have to follow the chart. You find your machine in the chart. So your machine will either be like a type A, B, C, D, etc. It'll give it a letter. And then once you know your machine's letter, you can go through that catalog and it'll tell you exactly which foot is compatible with your machine. And what's great about this catalog also is there are different styles of feet for different ages of machines. So the machines up until the 90s used a certain type of foot, and then the machines from the 90s forward use a different type of foot that actually accommodates for the automatic needle threader. And so there are two slightly different styles. Well, if you've got that accessory catalog, it'll tell you which of those two you need. So when you go to the store, you know exactly what you need to buy.
Perfect. The next question is, if you can explain really quick, what is the difference between using a dual feed and the walking foot for binding?
Okay, absolutely. So when it comes to dual feed and walking foot, this is always a big question of like, when do I use which one and what's the purpose of it? So what you want to think about your dual feed is really to help keep your two fabrics feeding at the same rate. And you'll notice that the dual feed is only behind the foot, not in front of the foot. And so for piecing or for matching plaids or for keeping two shifty fabrics from shifting apart, that's where your dual feed is really going to come in handy. It's keeping your fabrics feeding at the same rate, the top fabric and the bottom fabric feeding at the same rate. Where the walking foot comes in handy is it's actually giving you a little extra oomph to your feeding process. The feed dogs are in the front. So the top feed dogs are in the front of the needle, so it's actually kind of pulling the fabric through. And so anytime you're working with bulk, whether you're quilting or sewing on the binding and you're wanting to make sure that bulk feeds through evenly and doesn't have any trouble getting through, that's when that walking foot is going to come in handy. So if it's for actually sewing on the binding, I would use the walking foot.
Perfect. Let's see. Terry has a question. She has an 880 Crystal Edition, and she would love to use invisible thread. And can you go over what the perfect setup for her machine to sew with invisible thread?
Yeah, so every machine's going to be a little bit different, but what you're going to find with invisible thread is you probably are going to need to adjust the top tension a little bit. And usually that means you're going to loosen the top tension a little bit. On your B880 Crystal Edition, the top tension is going to be in the top left corner of your machine. You're going to see the little tension icon and you're just going to select it and you can just reduce that top tension a little bit. That should be the only adjustment you need to make when using your invisible thread. One thing though is if you're using invisible thread in the top and the bobbin, one thing I would recommend is when you are winding that invisible thread to slow down the speed. So on the BERNINA machines, when you're winding your bobbin, you can slow down the speed of winding. And I have found with invisible thread that if it's winding too fast, it actually can put a little too much tension on the thread as it's winding, and so it ends up kind of slightly stretched on that bobbin. So if you slow down the process when you're winding that bobbin, it's going to wind on a little smoother and not have that extra tension on the thread, which is going to help it feed a little bit better.
Awesome. One question from Tina. Can I use Glide 60 for piecing or should I only use cotton thread? I know this is another topic of debate, but do you have anything to add to that?
Absolutely. So I do sometimes piece with polyester thread. When I do piece with polyester thread, I personally like the Mettler Metricine, but if you've used Glide with success and you like it, there's nothing wrong with using a polyester thread. So let me tell you the reason people say to use polyester thread, and that is two reasons. One, the thread and the fabric will shrink at different rates when you wash it. And two, the polyester thread will last longer than the cotton fabric and will actually cause wear, and your quilt will actually possibly start to come apart at the seams because the polyester thread will wear into the cotton fabric. So the difference is that really did used to be true. Because the cotton fabrics were not as sturdy as cotton fabrics are today, and the polyester thread and the cotton were so different from each other that you would have different rates of wear. What we have found these days is that the quality of cotton fabrics has improved so significantly, and the density of that cotton fabric. You'll also find that your cotton fabric does shrink, but doesn't shrink nearly as much as it used to because of the quality of how that cotton fabric is produced, that it's much less of a problem than it used to be. Now, if you're trying to create an archival quality quilt that is going to last hundreds of years, then you do probably want to use cotton thread when you're using cotton fabric and polyester thread when you're using polyester fabric. But for those quilts where it's going to get a lot of wash and a lot of wear, a polyester thread is actually a great idea because it will hold up really well in the wash.
Okay, and let me move my backs over here so I can, there's a long question. Looks like Linda, for those of us who have back issues, what is the best way to stand at a sewing machine while you sew? She's like, I have a 790 plus on a Husky height adjustable table for my embroidery work. I would like to be able to stand without losing my balance when sewing and piecing. Do you have any ideas?
I don't have a lot of ideas about this, but I also do like to stand when I sew sometimes, and I do also use a height adjustable table. There are a lot of different height adjustable tables out there in your market, and so I do like that. One thing that you might find handy when you are using a height adjustable table and you're standing is that sometimes you're not quite at eye level with the machine because you can't ever quite get it quite as high up as you would have if you'd been sitting at it. And so you might find that you need to put a wedge under the machine to slightly tip it one way or the other. And they do make some wedges out there that work for this. So that would be something that you could look into. But in terms of steadying yourself, I have seen people who use a tall chair just to have something to lean against. Another thing that can be really helpful is to learn to sew with your left foot instead of sewing with your right foot, especially if you're kind of right-footed, so that you want more stability on your right leg, sewing with your left foot instead of your right foot. And then finally, another technique that might help you is to learn to sew with the stop and go button, because then you aren't using your feet at all to do the sewing. You're actually using the start and go button to start and stop stitching. Now, for piecing, personally, I think I would have a little bit of a hard time using the start and go button, but like for quilting, using the start and go button is great because you're not using your feet at all to control the sewing.
Sure. I also know I have a anti-fatigue mat that I stand on as well at my cutting and sewing table. It also helps my feet. So we have time for one last question. It has to do with the walking foot. Can you use the walking foot and use decorative stitches?
Like for quilting, absolutely. You can definitely use decorative stitches for quilting. Personally, I really like the serpentine stitch, which I think is stitch number 6. So that's a great stitch for decorative quilting or for quilting. If you're trying to finish in a hurry, I would tell you that decorative stitching is going to take you longer, right? Because every stitch is going to take a bit longer to finish because it's a decorative stitch. But if you want that look, you absolutely can quilt with a decorative stitch. Now for sewing on your binding, I use a decorative stitch all the time. I love the way it looks to do a decorative stitch for sewing that binding on. I'm especially a big fan of the feather stitch, which you can find in the quilting menu of the BERNINA machines. That one is a really lovely one for sewing your binding in place.
I know I'm a fan of the single fold binding, and I use the walking foot with the blanket stitch and just use the center guide, and I love the way it turns out, and it's very quick. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We learned lots of great tips from Christy on those fast finish quilts. The webinar was recorded and it'll be available in a few days on BERNINA.com and YouTube. The follow-up email will also go out and we'll include the link again for the Dropbox and to view the video. Make sure you tune in next time. Have a great day.
Bye.